There are winter nights when the natural world seems to reach a decision about reminding human beings of their actual scale in the order of things. Not through hostility, exactly the storm has no intention, but the effect is the same. The comfortable assumptions about shelter and warmth and the reliability of walls suddenly feel provisional, contingent, dependent on 1,000 small engineering decisions that were made decades ago by people who are no longer around to explain them. This was one of those nights in the Cascades Valley, on a Tuesday in late January. The afternoon weather forecast had used the word moderate, a word that, in the vocabulary of Pacific Northwest meteorology, carries approximately the same relationship to actual conditions as the word fine carries in a British understatement. By 9 o'clock that evening, a foot of new snow had accumulated on the valley floor. By 10:30, 2 feet. By midnight, the snowpack had exceeded 3 feet and was still building at a rate that suggested it had no particular plans to stop. The wind was not vertical. It moved horizontally, or close enough to horizontal to make the distinction academic, driving ice crystals that were closer in texture to ground glass than to snowflakes against anything that protruded above the surface fence posts, mailboxes, the antenna on top of the ranger station, the outer wall of any building unlucky enough to face northwest. Temperature, -18 Celsius, and trending. The kind of night that earns adjectives in the following morning's reports. The kind of night that gets remembered in a valley for years. Jack Harmon was sitting in his cabin on the eastern rim of the valley, 7 kilometers from the nearest paved road, further still from the nearest occupied dwelling. The cabin was modest by any reasonable standard: 1 bedroom, a kitchen with appliances that worked reliably if you didn't ask too much of them, a main room that held an armchair with permanent indentations in the cushion from 15 years of use, a set of bookshelves that were organized in a system that made sense only to their owner, and the cast-iron wood stove that was the cabin's circulatory system, its heat moving through the single interior space the way blood moves through a body, reaching every corner in roughly equal measure. Jack was a forest ranger, 15 years in this district, and he had long since made his peace with the particular texture of solitude that comes from living at the end of a road that is not maintained after the first significant snowfall of the season. He had learned, more precisely, to regard it not as solitude at all, but as a different kind of company, the company of the storm itself, which was present and enormous, and completely indifferent to whether he found it comfortable. Tonight, he had a fire going that had taken the interior temperature to a reliable 20 degrees despite the -18 outside. He had a mug of coffee brewed from beans he ground himself, because in the absence of much else he could control, in a storm like this, he could control that. He had a book about forest ecology that he'd been working through for 2 weeks and was genuinely enjoying. The storm roared against the northwest wall, and the fire answered from inside, and Jack was, in any honest accounting, entirely content. Not wind. He had learned the wind's entire vocabulary over 15 years in this valley. The sustained single-note howl, the shift in pitch when it found a new gap in the eaves, the deeper resonance when it came around the south corner and hit the stovepipe at a particular angle. Not a tree failing that had its own sound, a slow, crackling buildup followed by the concussive impact of something large hitting frozen ground. Not the groan of the roof joists redistributing the snowpack's weight, which was a sound he heard several times tonight and had learned not to find alarming. This was none of those. This was a scratching. Rhythmic, deliberate, insistent, coming from the front door with the quality of something that had a specific goal and was pursuing it with focused intention. He put the book down, looked at the door, listened for the repetition. It came. Scratch, scratch, scratch. A brief pause, then again with an urgency that made the hair on his forearms prickle even in the warmth of the room. Jack set his mug down, stood, pulled on the fleece he kept on the hook by the door, and opened it. What he saw stopped him completely. Standing in the doorway, standing more precisely in the narrow vertical strip of relative shelter that the doorframe provided against the horizontal assault of the blizzard, was a Pallas's cat. The species that local naturalists and the occasional biologist passing through called the mountain phantom, for reasons that anyone who had tried to reliably observe one in the wild would find obvious. They are extraordinarily elusive. They move through montane terrain with a fluency that seems to belong to a different physics than the one that governs larger mammals, appearing and disappearing in landscapes where a competent observer would swear there was no cover adequate to conceal them. Sightings in this valley were documented at a rate of perhaps 4 or 5 per decade. Jack had worked this district for 15 years and had seen one once, briefly, at 300 meters through binoculars, and had counted it among the most significant wildlife encounters of his professional life. Now one was standing on his doorstep. Her fur, the species' defining characteristic, thick enough to function as insulation even in the deep cold of Central Asian winters, far thicker than any domestic cat, and several times denser, was matted with ice in large, irregular patches. The kind of accumulation that takes hours of exposure, in conditions like tonight's, to produce. Her tail, short and heavily furred, was clamped against her body in the involuntary posture of an animal using every available physiological resource to retain core heat. Her feet were planted in the snow, and Jack did not want to think about what that contact felt like after however long she had been out in this. She did not run. That was the first thing that penetrated Jack's astonishment as a fact requiring attention. A wild Pallas's cat, a species so constitutionally wary of humans that the consensus among field biologists was that they fled at distances exceeding 100 meters, was standing on his threshold and not moving. Every evolutionary protocol that had kept her lineage alive across millions of years said run. The presence of a large, upright primate at close range in an enclosed space, at night, in conditions that already represented a physiological crisis, every component of that situation was a trigger for immediate flight. She did not move. She looked directly at his face, and in the 2 or 3 seconds while he processed what he was seeing, she held that gaze with an expression that defied the categories he had available. It was not aggression. It was not the frozen paralysis of an animal too frightened to react. It was, as near as he could read it, and he had spent 15 years reading the body language of wild animals, which gave him at least a working vocabulary, purposeful. She was looking at him the way a person looks at someone they need something from and are trying to determine whether the ask is going to land. Then she made a sound. Not a hiss, not a growl, not any of the defensive vocalizations that wild felids produce in close-range human encounters. The sounds that say, "Back away," or "I will make this worse for both of us." What she produced was something he had no prior reference for in 15 years of field work, a sound closer in acoustic character to the cry of a human infant than to any animal vocalization in his experience. High-pitched, wavering, broken into short segments by what seemed like physical effort, as if the sound cost her something to produce. It carried what he could only describe, knowing how imprecise the description was, as pain. Not the pain of a physical injury, though he couldn't rule that out. The specific timbre of distress that exists one register above pain, the sound of urgency that has run out of alternatives. The sound of a last resort. He felt it in his chest before his brain had finished categorizing it, a physical response that bypassed the intellectual processing entirely. And then she stepped back, 1 step, onto the snow outside the shelter of the doorframe, and turned her head to look into the darkness behind her. Then turned back to look at Jack, then looked into the darkness again. The gesture was not ambiguous. He had seen animals make this movement before dogs overwhelmingly, occasionally horses the specific kinetic vocabulary of "come with me." It was a movement that existed in the behavioral repertoire of social species that had evolved in contexts where recruiting assistance from other individuals was a viable strategy. He had never seen it in a solitary wild felid. He was seeing it now, in -18 degrees, in a blizzard that had already deposited 3 feet of snow and showed no interest in stopping, at 20 minutes to midnight. She looked at him one more time, then at the darkness, then at him. Some calls for help need no language to be understood. They only need someone quiet enough to listen. Jack dropped to his knees beside her and began to dig. He was not wearing gloves designed for this. The leather palms were adequate for grip and wind protection, not for sustained contact with frozen rock and compacted ice, but he registered this fact the way you register information that is true but not currently relevant. He worked with both hands, using the edge of his palm as a scoop in the loose upper material and his fingers to grip and move the larger chunks, pulling frozen debris back and away from the entrance with a rhythm that his body found without his mind directing it. Maya did not stop. She worked beside him, and the image of that, a woman, a man, a wild animal in a mountain blizzard, working side by side at a pile of frozen rubble, was one he knew even in the moment he would never fully be able to convey to anyone who hadn't been there. There was a quality of shared purpose to it that transcended the category of human-animal interaction. They were just two warm-blooded creatures who needed the same thing to happen and were applying whatever they had available toward making it happen. He dug, she dug. The storm continued its indifferent work around them. 8 minutes, perhaps 10. He wasn't checking his phone. Time had restructured itself around the single variable of progress. Each handful of material removed was a unit of time, not the seconds on a clock, but the actual forward movement of the work, and he was measuring in those units. The entrance was opening, slowly, against the consolidated resistance of the material, but opening. He could see the darker space behind the debris beginning to emerge. As the layer thinned, not daylight, the interior would be completely dark, but the absence of the compressed ice and rock texture, the presence of airspace. He pushed his arm in to the elbow, felt the temperature differential immediately. The interior of the recess, insulated by the very debris that had sealed it, was significantly warmer than the outside air. Not warm, but warmer. The difference between -18 and perhaps -2 or 3, which was the difference between rapidly fatal and survivable, if barely, and then his fingers touched something soft. He went absolutely still for 1 second. Then, he moved his hand deeper, slowly, with the particular care you use when you cannot see what you're touching and need your fingertips to be your eyes. He felt fur. Dense, soft, the specific texture of very young fur that has not yet developed the coarser outer layer of an adult coat. He felt the warmth of it faint, very faint. The residual heat of a small body that had been maintaining its temperature in an enclosed space with some success, though success was doing work in that sentence that optimism was helping it carry. He felt movement. Not much. A small shift, reflexive. The involuntary muscular response of a body that is registering an external stimulus, even in the depth of cold-induced torpor. He exhaled. He widened the opening. It took another 4 minutes, working carefully now, aware of what was on the other side of the debris and adjusting his force accordingly. When the gap was large enough, he reached in with both hands and began to remove them one at a time. 6 kittens, each one small enough to fit in the cup of a single palm, each one with the dense, soft fur of the Pallas's cat breed in its juvenile form extraordinary insulation, the product of genetics refined over evolutionary time in environments far colder than this valley. And tonight, it had done the work it was designed for. They were cold. Their movements were slow, muted, the reduced frequency responses of bodies that had shifted metabolic resources away from activity and toward core preservation. But they were alive, all 6. He confirmed this by feeling for the small, rapid heartbeats, which were present in each one. Jack opened his outer jacket, settled all 6 against his chest, zipped the outer layer over them, and began the careful walk back to the cabin, through the blizzard, through the dark. Maya walked beside him the entire way home. She did not leave his side once. Jack did not deliberate. This is what he would remember afterward, when he had time to examine the sequence of decisions. The absence of any deliberation. He did not stand in the doorway, running a cost-benefit analysis of following a wild animal into a blizzard at midnight. He did not calculate wind chill or assess visibility or remind himself of the 7 kilometers between his cabin and the nearest paved road. The part of him that would normally have conducted that analysis seemed to have recognized, faster than reasoning could have, that there was no analysis to conduct. He put on the heaviest insulated jacket he owned, the one rated to -30 that he kept for exactly the category of night that tonight had become. He pulled on the wool balaclava. He took the headlamp from the hook by the door and clicked it onto his forehead and checked the batteries with one press of the button. He pulled on the heavy work gloves, the ones with the leather palms that were stiff from cold storage. He stepped outside. The storm hit him like a wall being pushed. The temperature differential between the cabin's interior and the outside air was approximately 38 degrees, and the body experienced that differential as something close to impact. He ducked his head, set his feet, and looked for Maya. She was waiting at the edge of the cabin's light, standing in the snow at exactly the distance where his headlamp began to lose coherence, her silver-gray fur dissolving at its edges into the darkness, as if she were partly made of it. When he came through the door, she turned immediately and began to move, and the calibration of her pace was something he would think about many times in the months that followed. She did not run. Running would have lost him within 30 seconds in those conditions. Zero visibility beyond 6 or 7 meters. Snow at knee depth in the open areas and waist depth in the places where it had drifted. She moved at a pace that required him to walk fast and occasionally jog to maintain contact, which kept her consistently at the outer edge of his headlamp's useful range, visible enough to follow. Not so close that she was leading him at his pace instead of hers. He did not know whether this was conscious. He did not know whether the word conscious even applied. What he knew was that it worked, and that the calibration was not accidental in 20 minutes of travel through deteriorating conditions. She never once let the gap between them exceed 10 or 12 meters, never once moved at a speed that would have left him behind. She was managing the distance. She was managing him. They moved through the pine forest for what his phone, which he'd shoved into an inside pocket before leaving, force of habit later told him was 19 minutes. In that 19 minutes, the combination of darkness and snowfall and the disorienting sameness of the forest understory, under 3 feet of undifferentiated white, erased every landmark he would normally have used to orient himself. He knew this section of forest in daylight and in most weather conditions. Tonight, it was unrecognizable. He was following a small, gray shape through a white world, trusting her navigation absolutely because the alternative, stopping, losing her, trying to find his way back alone, was not an alternative he wanted to examine too closely. The cold was significant. His exhaled breath froze on the balaclava around his mouth, and the ice pulled at the fabric with each inhalation. The wind came through the trees at irregular intervals, hitting from angles that the tree line redirected unpredictably, and each gust carried enough force to stagger him. He kept his head down and his eyes on Maya. She kept moving. Then she stopped. Before him, in the headlamp's beam, was a rock formation, or what had been one. 2 large granite boulders that had been part of this hillside for considerably longer than any human building in the valley, between which a natural gap had formed over geological time, a recess, a shelter, the kind of space that small animals find and use and that larger animals note as a feature of the terrain. Something had been sheltering here. He could see the evidence in the snow around the entrance, the compression pattern, the slight depression in the snowpack indicating repeated use, the absence of the pristine, undisturbed surface that surrounded every other square meter of terrain tonight. But the entrance was gone. The snow accumulation on the overhanging rock surfaces had reached a weight that the formation could not sustain, and at some point in the last few hours, he would never know exactly when, and it didn't matter, the overhang had collapsed. The entrance to the recess was now a dense, compacted mixture of snow and ice and rock debris, perhaps 60 centimeters of material where there had been open space, and it had the consolidated solidity of something that had been under pressure for hours, rather than something that had just fallen. Maya was clawing at it. Her front paws were moving in rapid, alternating strokes against the surface, small eruptions of ice and compacted snow flying backward with each pass, and the sound her claws made on the frozen material was a high, insistent scraping that cut through the wind. She had been doing this for some time before she went for help. He could see blood on the snow around her feet. Inside the cabin, the warmth was almost shocking. After the exposure, Jack felt it as a physical pressure on his skin, the heat of 20 degrees against a body that had been in -18 for the better part of an hour. He didn't stop to appreciate it. He moved straight to the table near the stove, spread the warmest towel he owned, A thick cotton bath towel he kept for field work, laundered often enough that it was soft throughout, and laid the 6 kittens on it in a row. They were still. Not alarmingly still, not the stillness of bodies that had lost the internal argument, but the reduced animation stillness of hypothermia. All metabolic resources directed inward, minimum activity, maximum conservation. Alive. He confirmed it again by touch, by the heartbeats that were present and slightly more regular than they'd been outside. He went to the kitchen and filled a bowl with water from the tap and adjusted the temperature with a thermometer 40 degrees Celsius, the standard for hypothermia recovery in small animals, warm enough to transfer heat efficiently, cool enough not to cause the vascular shock that too sudden warming produces. He soaked small washcloths and began, working with both hands, one animal at a time, the gentle circular pressure that stimulates circulation without startling a system that is already under stress. He talked to them while he worked. Low, continuous, the same nothing words he'd used in other difficult field situations. The stove ticked and radiated. Maya jumped onto the table within a minute of their arrival. Jack noted this, the unself-conscious movement of a wild animal into an enclosed human space, onto a human surface, in proximity to a human being, with zero apparent hesitation, and filed it in the category of things that the night had already made him revise his assumptions about. She went to the kittens immediately, nosing each one, and then she began to purr. Not the purr of a domestic cat in a warm lap, which is a sound of contentment and ease. This was something with more architecture to it, a deeper fundamental frequency, a sustained vibration that she seemed to generate from the center of her chest and project outward with intention, a sound aimed at the small bodies on the towel, the way a beam of light is aimed. Purring in felids operates at frequencies between 25 and 150 Hz, a range that research has shown promotes bone density repair and tissue healing, that reduces cortisol and stimulates parasympathetic activation in the purring animal itself and in nearby recipients. Jack knew some of this. In the moment, he watched the kittens' bodies respond to the sound, the small movements becoming more frequent, the eyes beginning to open in slow blinks, and closing again, and opening a little wider the next time. Jack sat back in the armchair and watched. There was nothing more for him to do. The recovery was happening on its own now, under Maya's management, at the pace that small bodies, returning from the edge of hypothermia, set for themselves. He watched her work. The systematic grooming of each kitten, the rough tongue moving in the direction of the fur's growth, stimulating the circulation beneath the skin, transferring her own warmth through the contact. The smallest one, the one at the end of the row, the one whose first uncertain sound had marked the turning point of that January night, shivered, then shivered again, then produced a sound. High, thin, uncertain. Then a second cry, steadier. Then it moved toward Maya's purring, with the purposeful, uncoordinated scramble of a very young animal that knows what warmth is and where it is coming from. Jack's shoulders shook, not from cold. There are moments when the body processes what has just happened through the only channel available when language is inadequate. He let it happen. He sat in the armchair and watched 6 kittens breathe, which was, in the arithmetic of that night, everything. When all 6 kittens had finally settled into the deep, even breathing of animals that have been frightened and cold and are now warm and safe and certain of both, Maya stood. She had been curled around them for 2 hours, her purring diminished to a low continuous hum, her eyes moving between the kittens and the man in the chair with the regular sweep of a creature maintaining 2 important things simultaneously. Now she stood, stretched in the full-body way of cats, and walked across the table toward Jack. She stopped at his hand, his right hand, lying open on the table surface, fingers relaxed. She lowered her head and pressed her forehead against the back of his hand, not a brief touch. A sustained contact, several seconds, the full weight of her head resting against his skin, the scent glands at her temples in direct contact with the back of his hand. In the behavioral biology of felids, this gesture bunting, head pressing, is a specific communicative act rather than an incidental movement. It deposits scent from the facial glands onto the recipient's surface. It receives scent from that surface in return. It constitutes a marking not in the territorial sense that the word usually carries in descriptions of animal behavior, but in the relational sense. This belongs to my world. This is part of what I know. This is recognized. She held the contact for what he estimated was 5 or 6 seconds. Long enough that he felt the warmth of her against his skin, felt the pressure, felt the specific aliveness of it, the breathing body, the quiet mind behind those amber eyes that were half closed in the contact. Then she lifted her head, looked at him once, directly. Then she turned, walked back to her kittens, arranged herself among them, and closed her eyes. Jack did not sleep that night. He sat in his armchair and he tended the fire, and he watched the storm exhaust itself against the windows, the wind dropping gradually through the early morning hours, the snow shifting from horizontal to diagonal to, by 4 in the morning, something approaching vertical, which in local terms constituted the end of the serious weather. He watched 7 animals sleep beside his stove. He drank 2 more cups of coffee. He did not read. He did not look at his phone. There was nothing he needed from either of those things that the room was not already providing. The fire ticked. The kittens breathed. Maya's purring continued at its low frequency, quieter now, the sound of a system at rest rather than a system working. Outside, the storm was finishing its business. Inside, everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be. 3 months later, on the first morning of April, when the snow had finally retreated from the valley floor and left the ground in the complicated state of early spring still frozen an inch below the surface, softening rapidly on top, the soil working out its relationship with the sun, Jack heard something outside the cabin window while he was making coffee. He looked out. Maya was on the flat rock 15 meters from the cabin, the broad granite surface that caught the morning sun and held it, that Jack used as a landmark when navigating back from the eastern section of his patrol route. She was sitting on it with the composed, upright posture of an animal that is entirely at ease in its environment, her thick gray fur catching the April light differently than it had in the headlamp beam of January, warmer, less silver, the color of old wood and morning cloud. Around her, on the rock and on the ground below it, and in the first sparse growth of grass at the rock's edge, were 6 young Pallas's cats. Not kittens anymore, or not entirely. They had the proportions of adolescents, the gangly, not quite resolved quality of animals that had grown into their paws, but not yet into the full gravity of adulthood. 1 was wrestling its sibling on the ground. 2 were investigating something at the base of a nearby pine. The smallest one, the one from the end of the row, was batting at the last small patch of snow remaining in the shadow of the rock, with the focused attention of an animal discovering winter from a position of safety. He stood at the window for a long time. She did not look away during that time, and neither did he. They looked at each other across 15 meters of April morning in the way that 2 individuals look at each other when they share a specific history and both know it. He did not reach for his phone. He had thought about this over the 3 months of winter, whether he would photograph her if he saw her again, whether the instinct to document would be stronger than the instinct to simply be present. Standing at the window with the coffee cooling in his hand, the question answered itself without requiring his deliberate input. He watched her. Then, very slowly, she lowered her head once a deliberate inclination, not the incidental downward movement of an animal glancing at the ground, but a movement with a specific beginning and end, a specific intentionality. Then she stood, produced a sound, a short, low vocalization that carried none of the urgency of January's cry, and all 6 young cats collected themselves from their various activities, and the family walked into the pine forest and was gone. The trees took them. The morning continued. Jack stood at the window for another minute, then went back to the stove and poured a fresh cup and sat with what he'd just seen for a while before doing anything else, because some things deserve that. Jack did not know why he opened the door that night, or, more accurately, he knew, but the knowing was not of a kind that assembled itself easily into explanation. It was not because he was unafraid. He was afraid of the cold, of the storm, of the dark, of the 7 kilometers between his cabin and help, of what it would mean to be disoriented in those conditions. It was not because he had calculated the odds and found them acceptable. He had not calculated anything. He opened the door because something in that room, in the quality of Maya's gaze, in the specific acoustic character of the sound she had made, addressed a part of him that was older than language and deeper than reasoning, a part that pre-existed all the systems of thought and caution and self-preservation that his adult life had layered on top of it. That part answered before the rest of him had finished formulating the question. This is, he thinks now, what compassion actually is. Not a decision arrived at through deliberation, not a value applied to a situation after analysis, but a response, a specific kind of attentiveness to the fact that something else is in distress, combined with the absence of the hesitation that would normally stand between the awareness and the action. It is the gap closing. Whatever was on the other side of that door was in distress. He was here. The door was between them. He opened it. Compassion is not a feeling. This is the thing he has come to believe, sitting with the memory of that night over the months since. It is an act, or more precisely, it is the collapse of the distance between awareness and act. It is the moment when knowing that something is in need and doing something about the need become functionally the same moment, with no deliberation filling the gap between them. That night, in the blizzard, a wild animal and a human being each closed that gap as completely as they were capable of. She came to his door with everything she had, the willingness to approach the creature, her every instinct named as danger, the willingness to make the vulnerable sound, the willingness to lead him through conditions that were dangerous for her too, because the alternative was unacceptable. He followed with everything he had, his body heat, his hands, his knowledge, his willingness to be cold and disoriented and afraid in service of a need he hadn't chosen to encounter but had encountered nonetheless. 6 small animals are alive because both of them close the distance. The thread between them, between her world and his, between the wild and the inhabited, is not made of anything that breaks easily. He has felt it since. The thread is still there. Compassion is the most sacred thread connecting all living things, and that thread once tied does not break easily. Jack opened the door not because he was a hero. He opened it because he heard, because he paid attention, because the gap between awareness and action that night was almost zero. That's all compassion requires, not extraordinary strength, not great sacrifice. Just enough attention to hear the scratching at the door amidst the storm, and enough courage to open the door. If Jack and Maya's story resonates with you today, share this video with a friend you think needs a reminder that listening and reaching out is the bravest act an ordinary human being can make. Leave a comment. Have you ever heard that scratching at the door in your life a small signal from someone who needs you? Did you open the door? Press follow because episode 4 is coming, with another story about moments where the bond between humans and the wild is more evident than any words can. Thank you for being here with us. See you next episode. Keep your door open.